Welcome back to the Carbon Exposure Project, where we explore the people, policies, and pathways shaping the future of climate finance. Today's episode is a special collaboration, recorded live at the IETA European Climate Summit in Lisbon and hosted by my colleague Edward Smith from This Week in Carbon. Our guest is David Antonioli, a name synonymous with carbon markets. As the founding CEO of Verra, David helped to shape the very infrastructure that has underpinned the voluntary carbon market for close to 2 decades. Now, with the benefit of perspective, he's asking harder questions, like what happens when the carbon party ends? And what if credits aren't the destination, but just the catalyst? In this conversation, David reflects on lessons from inside the engine room of the VCM, outlines a vision for simplifying market rules, and makes the case for carbon as a tool to accelerate real-world transitions, not a crutch to delay them. From biochar to baseline reform, he doesn't hold back. This is a rare, unfiltered conversation with someone who's been at the heart of it all and who now wants to help to build something better. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project.
All right, so we are live from the European Climate Summit in Portugal.
Yeah.
And with me is David Antonioli. Thank you for being here. Former CEO of Verra. And I think it'd be great, for the audience, if you could maybe explain your background a little bit.
Sure.
Obviously, people are familiar with you in this space. You know, you're a very famous guy. Nah, but besides Verra, what else did you participate in with regards to the market beforehand?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be on the work that you guys do. So first, thank you. I was most recently the CEO of Verra. I was the founding CEO. I ran Verra for 14 and a half years. And prior to that, I had worked for Ecosecurities, which is one of the largest CDM project developers. And at Ecosecurities, I ran a joint venture that developed landfill gas projects all around the world. Before that, I worked for USAID and did a bunch of stuff. I've been doing climate work for about 30 years. So,
wow.
And obviously the most recent role is at Verra. And since I left Verra, I was able to take the time and write a report setting out my insights on the carbon markets. So here I am.
Awesome. Well, yeah, obviously a wealth of experience. Lucky to have you sit on the board of one of the companies that we're building out. But, you wrote a very interesting piece on financing the transition that the world needs, right? And creating a new paradigm for the carbon markets.
Yeah.
It's very insightful, and I think it'd be great if you could unpack that for us.
Sure.
and tell us about your motivation for writing that, as well as some of the biggest challenges that the voluntary market faces today, and how we can address those challenges and solve them and move forward and scale this market, right?
So the motivation really was, after spending all the time at Verra, I wanted to take some time and reflect and distill some of the thinking and some of the ideas that I'd been having, but maybe was not ever able to implement. And so, just to be clear, it isn't just about the voluntary market, it's about carbon markets generally. And I had a few insights. The most critical one, I think, kind of embodying the whole carbon market, is this concern that I have that we haven't thought about what happens at the end of the party. What I mean by that is that when the last carbon credit is sold and there's no more money come from carbon finance, what then?
What happens?
Exactly. Right? And we have not planned for that. I think generally we haven't planned for it because when we started this whole endeavor for carbon markets, we thought that the world would be regulated. In fact, when I took the role at Verra, I thought, well, great, this is a 5-year job. Obama had been elected. We were going to have cap and trade. We were going to be able to turn the lights out, close the door, be done with it, and move on, because the world was going to have a regulated approach to climate change. But that didn't happen. So we really haven't had to contend with the idea, what happens when the last carbon credit is sold? And so that then leads you to think about, well, what are we trying to achieve with carbon? And what I believe we should be doing is really using carbon as a tool to catalyze the kinds of transformations that the world really needs. So that means we need to drive a lot of scale into the market, and we need to simplify the access process, the point the entry point, meaning how you approve projects,
Mm-hmm.
rather than prosecuting it for every single project, which means you have to prepare long documentation that has to be reviewed, that ends up creating cumbersome, costly, time-consuming processes. Let's, for example, take additionality and define it up front. Let's
Yes.
do that up front. Let's do the analysis, identify what we know is additional within certain contexts, and then say, this is additional, and let's move forward. That enables investment to flow.
Yeah.
The final piece is that we haven't figured out when to stop crediting to new activities, right? So we lived through this when we did the decision on renewable energies.
Yeah.
And we decided at some point that it wasn't additional. Verra and Gold Standard roughly at the same time said no more. And that caused a lot of stress for the market. And in the end of the day, we made nobody happy, because all the NGOs said, well, you should have done this years ago. And all the developers said, no, you should still keep it going. What we need is objectively verifiable data that we can use to determine when you no longer should be approving projects, right? And that's when ideally you deliver enough scale and volume to a particular sector that you've actually reduced costs, addressed the risks, had enough experiences in the market that the activity becomes common practice.
So it becomes, there's a sustainable transition that it can support itself after the term of the project, right?
Exactly.
So, like, I think, one of your examples was biochar, right? If we can use carbon credit revenues in the agriculture sector to drive market penetration of biochar to increase every year, by the time the last credit is issued, like you said, now biochar is commonly used practice, and it's actually more cost effective for the farmers. And now it's the best way to go about fertilizer and to use it for your crops and everything. So that's kind of driving the sustainable change, right? Because most projects, after that last credit is issued, there's ongoing funding dries up, and there's no way to know if 50 to 100 years from now, these trees could be cut down for this project, right?
Exactly.
So I think that's spot on, right? And I think we can unpack this maybe from a business lens as well, because I liked what you said in regards to additionality. It asked the question, would this project have happened anyway, right? And I think for a lot of projects, not a lot of projects get approved because of the additionality aspect. And for institutional investors, projects that rely on 99% of their revenues from carbon credits that are being sold 10, 20, 30 years in the future, it's just too risky.
Right.
So there's an underlying asset aspect that needs to be tied back into this, because companies, specifically, let's say agroforestry businesses, just as an example, to be able to convert their liabilities, which are emissions, to monetizable assets as carbon credits and use that as a revenue stream that falls on top of their underlying business. That is when you can drive that sustainable change in that transition that lasts ongoing, without, with the last credit being issued, it pushes that transition, right? So maybe you can touch on, the underlying business aspects of carbon projects, because then I think this also confuses some people in the market. Am I a carbon project developer, or am I a biochar business?
Exactly.
So, and this is where you get into these debates. But at the institutional level, they want to invest in intrinsic value in assets that have, returns that aren't volatile, that don't have all these risks tied to it, right? So maybe we can, that was a long framing, but maybe can you unpack this aspect of your piece for us, this underlying
I think
business?
you hit the nail on the head, and the biochar example is a great one. So I think I see the world kind of in a couple different buckets. The bucket that you're describing are projects that have some sort of underlying economic value to them. And those are really important. And unfortunately, in the carbon markets, we penalize those projects because they may not be additional. And I think that's the wrong way to look at it, because what we're doing there is we're actually undermining the ability of carbon finance to drive the transitions that we really need, right? So what I think is really important, I mentioned before, is if we can identify what is additional, and you need to have different tests to do that, but if you do that up front, right? The problem with our current approach mostly is that you have to develop and justify every single project, and every one literally becomes an exercise in creative writing. Rather than doing this up front, determining what is additional kind of by definition. And by the way, this is how a lot of markets work. That's how the California market works. That's how Australia's market works. And that's how they're able to generate scale, because it gives investors confidence. And if we have confidence that the rules have been established in a way that enables investment in activities that wouldn't happen, well, then you start to generate scale. And so for these kinds of projects, I think it's really important that we have a much more streamlined and efficient way of approving them and enabling finance to flow to them, because that's what's going to reach the scale. And when you hit the tipping point, meaning when you reach enough market penetration, take the biochar example you mentioned, right? If you build a biochar, the first biochar plant built in this particular region, well, it's going to be, the technology is not going to be the most efficient. It's still building it, trying to figure out how it works. You're trying to figure out where you're getting your inputs from, right? The people buying, you still don't know where you're going to sell it. So there's a lot of risks, right? And on paper, this actually might pencil out. But the reality is that you have to contend with a lot of obstacles. So if you can use carbon finance to help finance that transition, so you get, I don't know, let's say, 20 biochar plants. By then they've figured out where the inputs are coming from. They figure out there's actually a market for the biochar that you're producing. And now it's an ongoing business. Now you don't need carbon finance. If we can define that moment, if let's just say 20 is the right number, let's just say there's potential for 100 biochar plants in a particular region or country. And we say, okay, so the first 20 biochar plants are additional, kind of by definition. Well then, as an investor, you think, oh, I'm actually not a carbon project developer. I'm a biochar company, right? And I want to build biochar. I happen to be using carbon. And that's where I think we've gotten stuck, where we have a number of project developers that are really good at preparing documentation. But what we need is infrastructure and scale, whether it's for nature-based solutions or new facilities. That's what we need. And that's what ideally would make the investors say, oh, I see. You're not entirely dependent on carbon. Carbon will help you. And now actually you can make an investment. You know what the goalposts are. You know that the entry point is simplified. You know when it ends. And now I can actually, take on that risk because I can measure it. I can understand it. And it should allow capital to flow. So that's the basic theory. And then here's the key. This is really important. Let's say you build those 20 plants. If you get biochar to become a commonly accepted way of dealing with waste, or as a fertilizer, for example, guess what? You get plants 21 and 22 and 30 and 40 and 60. They all get built on their own. And that's the transition we need to drive towards. But that's what we're missing, because we're chasing each individual ton of carbon. If we frame it in different perspective, we have a better narrative to begin with, and we got scale. We actually can change the entire sector. That should be our North Star.
Yeah, very well said. And I think, this example is extremely relevant for nature-based solutions, right? For natural assets, such as reforestation projects and with agroforestry businesses or biochar, right? But then it makes me wonder about carbon removals from an engineered perspective or a technological removal perspective, because right now, no one really needs to invest in carbon removal. There's no, clear return on investment for, let's say, a direct air capture plant or, CCUS. These are projects with an extremely high cost of capital. And the only revenue stream comes from the sale of the carbon credits. And so I wanted to ask you a question there. Does that also correlate to these other types of projects? Because there are such a wide variety of projects in the carbon market. People get lost. We all get lost in the mix. There's a new project every couple of days. But do you think this correlates to all of the projects that might not have clear underlying businesses, as you would say?
So it does not, right? To be clear. So when I said buckets, I think of the world in 3 buckets. The first bucket are the ones that have an underlying economic proposition.
So
Biochar,
the specific projects.
regenerative ag,
ARR,
multi-technology. Oh, ARR, not necessarily, right? So
Yeah, not
if you're
necessarily.
so let me get to that. But there's some projects that have an underlying economic value to them, and you can envision a future where if you achieve scale, you reduce costs, address risks, that they can stand on their own. That's bucket number one. Bucket number two is the one you described, pure removals, right? And let's take engineered removals as an example. I think there will be a logic for that. The world will come, I hope, to a recognition that
You have
we've
to
got to
compensate.
remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that will be a long-term carbon play. There may not be an end game to that, but there may be some technologies where actually you're doing the carbon removal, even engineered, but you might be producing something. So you might be producing green hydrogen, for example,
Yep.
or CCUS, or whatever.
Exactly.
So some of them
They're
will have an
utilizing the
economic
carbon for
value. So there's there could be a hybrid. The third bucket, and I think was what you were getting at, are projects that don't have any kind of value beyond carbon, right? And those, whether it's a long-term play for removals that may have its own rationale, and the world hopefully comes around to recognizing that we need it, but there are other kinds of projects, and I did some of those, right? So when I developed landfill gas projects under ecomethane, some of them generated electricity. So they fall in that first bucket, right? They make sense economically. Once the carbon crediting ended, they're still fine, they're still operating. The ones that we just captured and destroyed the landfill gas, guess what? A lot of them are dead. The crediting period ended, the party ended, nobody was there to pick up the slack. The equipment got vandalized, right?
Yeah.
The pipes in the ground are rotted. The technicians we trained are working elsewhere. And so there's no long-term play. We need to figure out what plans for that looks like. And that applies to other kinds of projects. For example, forest conservation. When the party ends, what then? So I don't have all the answers. For example, Nate Truitt and the folks at American Forestry Foundation, I think you had them on the show. They're talking about a permanence trust, right? So over the course of the project, build a trust fund that then allows you, when the party's over, to have some resources to keep the activity going. Maybe you end up working with governments, right? And the governments take on the commitment. And maybe the commitment by the government isn't so daunting if there is a trust fund backing it up. For example, on the landfill gas projects, maybe what we need to do is go to the government and say, look, we're going to do a landfill gas project here, and it's going to last for, say, 10 years as a crediting period. But when it's over, will you commit to running that equipment and keeping it going? The capital costs, which are the most expensive, have been covered. We've now trained people and we know how to do it. And so it's really just operational costs. But as a benefit to your NDC, for example, right, will you keep the project operational? So I think there may be ways to think about this that doesn't leave us completely exposed when the party ends. I think that to me is one of the biggest risks we face.
No, very well said. And I would agree. I mean, this is something that is an ongoing debate and challenge in the market, given the complexity of this range of projects, right? But, and it comes down to additionality and leakage and these different kind of characteristics that go into approving projects. So, at the end of the day, it is a voluntary market in the sense of there's no true regulators in it, unless you're, in some compliance scheme in California or, a compliance scheme that's tied to a governmental crediting mechanism, right? But for the voluntary market, since no one has really, there's no penalties. People, can kind of withdraw whenever they choose or if things get too hard. So I think that ties back into some of the challenges we were discussing around additionality and underlying businesses. How do we get the market to change that narrative, and how do we overcome that issue of allowing the most, because some of the most high impact, the best environmental stewardship, the best biodiversity impact, the best socioeconomic impact, and the most maximize revenue, those projects have multiple revenue streams a lot of the times. And those most high impactful projects don't qualify for carbon credit financing.
Right.
So how do we overcome that barrier given the, you know, all the different stakeholders involved in the market? It almost feels like, you know, we're all on the same team, but we're shooting each other in the foot. You know?
Yes.
It's like we're all on the same team. So what do you think about this? Because you were obviously in a position at the forefront of the market for a very long time. And this market, you know, I hope, but I believe will be, you know, very long term for the next centuries to come, right? I think carbon as an asset class will become the next big commodities markets. So, but in order to achieve that, you know, challenges like what we just discussed need to be overcome, and it needs to scale. And there needs to be incentives, and there needs to be capitalism behind it. And that is another debate on its own. But I mean, if you look at energy attribute certificates, like RECs and sustainable aviation fuel certificates, those are kind of insets, but it drives down the cost of technology, and those projects are profitable. So, you know, and people tend to criticize carbon projects for being so profitable. It's like, oh, it's not additional. Oh, you know, so what do you think? How can we overcome this with, you know, and work together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I think you put your thumb on something that's really, really important, right? And I alluded to this at the beginning. The insight that I had about the market is that we've built this construct that is seemingly perfect, and yet is so complicated and so bespoke that every single project is slightly different than the other, even if it's the same project type. So we've kind of built a system that is lent itself to be questioned. So you look at any projects, right? Say 10 similar projects, cook stoves or, you know, reforest, whatever. Someone's going to find something different about one of them to argue that it's not additional. And so what we've done, we've kind of laid it on a platter for people to pick apart.
Yeah, we've embraced, we've penalized mistakes, or we've penalized.
Well, we enable people to call things out. So what I think California and Australia have done is that they said, look, let's dispense with this bespoke project by project assessment of additionality and everything. And let's just do the additionality assessment up front, right? So let's look across the landscape and say, what's being done and what's not being done, and what's good for the climate. And then set some guardrails and some procedures and some thinking and some analysis and all stakeholder consultation, all that stuff, but bring that up front so that you prosecute the idea once at the very beginning. And once you have that, then you know that all those projects that can be developed are additional and meet that criteria. And that allows capital to flow. Now, there's some things to be thought through, right? You need to check that list. So that list isn't forever, right? If you create a positive list with regenerative ag, for example, well, great. But you need to check that because at some point, you're going to start hitting those additionality thresholds. At some point, it becomes common practice. So again, you can either set that up front by setting out, for example, a certain market penetration threshold, or you can check it on a regular basis. But what you don't want to do is essentially catch the market off guard, right? Because investors have made decisions, and that's what you want to do. You want to give investors the confidence with the robustness that the market needs, right? To be able to claim like, oh, this is a real project, this is a real thing that wouldn't have happened, but you need to do that up front. And if you then drive those changes and those new businesses, my guess or my theory is that the narrative is going to be very different. Right? That all of a sudden now we're not just chasing tons of carbon for the sake of chasing a ton of carbon, but we're actually investing in new businesses.
It's true. I mean, it's a paradox within itself. And I almost think this industry, like I said before, we tend to shoot each other's, you know, ourselves in the foot here because we're all trying to overcome challenges and scale the market. You know, we need to make the projects bankable for investors to scale the market. And we also need to make the projects transparent and of high integrity and of high you know, quality for corporates as well, which are the two, you know, corporates and investors are one and the same. Sounds good. Thank you. But, and I would love, if we had more time, I would love to, dive into this with you. But corporates, obviously, specifically, in the US, are playing a huge role with regards to the future of the market, structuring very large long-term offtakes in the carbon removal space. And SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, has over 7,500 corporates that have set targets aligned with the Science Based Initiative. So I just, are we holding back corporates from entering this space and investing in mitigating their pollution, or we need to allow them to just come into this space with confidence,
Right.
instead of confusing them and
Yeah.
having them step away, which is what we've seen
Yeah.
this past year. We've seen large banks push back their climate targets.
Yeah.
We've seen airlines completely step away.
Yeah.
And they're blaming it on the fact that, it's things outside of their control. When in reality, it's not. It's
Right.
completely, what it comes down to is compensating for your pollution,
Yeah.
which is a negative externality. And, it's not mandated yet. It's not compliance, which I believe it will be in the future. But with regards to the projects, making them more investable, I think that is a key to scale the market.
Yeah.
But also, on the other side, make it more investable for corporations. Like I was just talking with Stephanie Zhu, our good friend from Yum Brands and Delta, and she was talking about these challenges and how, it really confuses these sustainability teams when one thing changes and
completely.
one month, the next month it's changed.
Yep.
Offsets, are they okay? Are they not okay?
Yeah.
People outside of the market, they criticize, but on the inside, they're really doing great things for the world. So, I think you had some really good points.
Yeah.
And, are there any final remarks you want to say in that regard?
Yeah, I do believe that we have made things perhaps a bit too complicated, and we need to streamline these, because right now, when a corporate enters this or a buyer wants to enter the market, it is incredibly confusing, and they need armies of people to make sense of it all, right? So that's why I think we need to streamline and simplify things and package things in a way that makes more sense to people, in a way that's thoughtful, because otherwise we've made the barriers to entry too big, and that's the problem. And there's the part relating to kind of what gets into the market, credits. Again, we've made that very complicated, and we made the claims piece really complicated. We haven't solved that at all.
Yeah.
And people keep saying, well, if only SBTI could say that it's okay to use offsets for a certain amount of your target, you'd be fine.
Then we would do it.
But it's like, well, when are we going to get there? We haven't yet figured that out.
Yeah. And in the background, the climate crisis is continuing to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we really do need to have a new paradigm for how we're thinking about this if we're going to really have this market have an impact. And which goes back to my point, right? If we're using carbon markets to build businesses of the future, or to build a transition because you've got a government commitment or a trust fund, I think that's more compelling. I think that's ultimately what we all want. And even a corporate who's just buying credits because they want to offset some of their emissions, whether historical or current or future, if you're actually financing a transition that is going to go beyond what you're contributing to that particular reduction, I think it's a compelling story.
Yeah.
I think it's an important thing.
Yeah.
And if I know that this investment I'm making and these reductions, right, where they're going to build a company for the future, right, that will eventually not need carbon finance, or it's going to actually make a government make a commitment, well, that's a really powerful concept that we haven't really incorporated because we haven't thought about what happens at the end of a project.
Yeah, no, very well said. And like you said, to build the companies of the future.
Yep.
I think the companies of the future are going to be the ones that are able to mitigate their emissions and provide clean technology, and that'll be more cost competitive to their counterparts that are using, fossil fuels or, fuels that aren't as clean, right? I think that's we're going to reach a point where it's attractive to invest in these things because
Exactly.
it mitigates these risks, it makes this more efficient, and makes this more effective. So it builds the business in a way that improves the value of the assets,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you've got carbon right now as the kind of the catalyzer, the catalyst, right?
Exactly.
Then that's what it is. It's just a catalyst to get the reaction going.
Yeah.
And once you build enough once you get
Yeah.
to the tipping point in biochar,
Exactly.
in our example, then boom, all of a sudden biochar is now
Now-
like, hey, this is a good idea.
Now this
right?
is more cost effective than what we used before.
Exactly. And
Exactly.
it works, and
Yeah.
there's a supply chain, and there's a market, and so great,
Yeah.
now you can scale without needing carbon. And that's the fundamental principle, the fundamental paradigm shift that I think we need.
Exactly. Well said.
Good.
Well, look, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for
Really
having me.
appreciate it,
Really
David.
a pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
pleasure.
Cheers.
Cheers.